What do Albert Einstein, Nikola Tesla, 3 Hollywood movies, countless articles, and multiple conspiracy theories have in common? Welcome to The In-Between. I'm Carol Ann, and today we delve into the true, partially not, hold on there, maybe, tale of the Philadelphia experiment. The year is 1943, and the U.S. and British navies have a problem. A big boom problem.
Bada boom.
We are deeply into World War II, and the U.S. needs to get military supplies and personnel across the Atlantic over to Great Britain. But the Germans have invented a new bomb that detects the change in the Earth's magnetic field from the metal hull of a ship and explodes as it passes overhead. And we are taking heavy losses. So the U.S. Navy starts trying to figure out how to make our metal ships not seem like metal ships. So they initiate Project Rainbow. They go out looking for a heavy hitter. And in the 1940s, if you needed a highfalutin scientist, who do you call?
Ghostbusters.
Not quite. Albert Einstein. Einstein actually works for the Navy from May of 1943 to June of 1944. And by the end of 1943, most large ships are pretty well protected by something called degaussing. Degaussing means making a ship's hull less attractive to magnetic mines by demagnetizing it. And that actually seems to work pretty well. But that's only the final result of the experiments. Rumor has it that in experimenting with different ways to make the ships invisible to German bombs, the Navy discovered something far more interesting: real invisibility and teleportation. So here's the official narrative of what went down behind closed doors. Can you call a conspiracy theory official? Sometime before 1943, the Navy first goes to Nikola Tesla and says, we need to make our ships invisible, like how the helicarrier in the Avengers can go incognito. Tesla says, I think I can do that. I love this guy. But we'll need to test it on empty ships with no crew. For some weird reason, the Navy says no, and Tesla says, I'm out. The Navy then goes to Albert Einstein. Einstein's been looking for a way to run some real-world experiments to test his unified field theory. Unified field theory is just a fancy way of saying that he was looking for proof that electromagnetic fields and gravitational fields are the same thing in different forms. So Einstein says, sure, let's give it a whirl. So this Navy vessel, a brand spanking new destroyer escort, or DE-173, named the Aldridge, is chosen as the ship to be experimented on in the Navy shipyard in Philadelphia. Lots of big equipment like magnetic coils and such are loaded onto and installed on the ship. In July of 1943, the first test commences. The machines are turned on and a very powerful electromagnetic field starts to build. A greenish haze develops, enveloping the whole ship, and then the ship starts to disappear, not just from radar, but from sight. It works! Then they turn the energy field off and the ship becomes visible again, and those on shore start high-fiving all around. But there are problems with the crew. They are all nauseous and disoriented. Well, that's a problem. Can't have a ship crossing the ocean with a crew that can't see straight. So the Navy says, well, we're kind of in a hurry here. We're losing more ships to the Germans every day, so let's forget about the invisibility part. We really just need to be invisible to radar and the magnetic bombs. Okay, so the machinery on the Aldridge is modified, and on October 28th, they run test number 2. The machines are turned on, and the electromagnetic field starts to grow, and just when everyone's about to start high-fiving again, there's a brilliant blue flash, and the Aldridge is gone. The Aldridge is then said to appear in port in Norfolk, Virginia, 10 minutes before it supposedly left Philadelphia. Hangs out for a few minutes, and then another flash of blue light, and she reappears in Philadelphia again. Amazing! Maybe for Einstein and the Navy, but not so amazing for the crew members. Turns out they are all kinds of messed up, all the way down to a molecular level. Some of the crew are phasing in and out of solidity. Some are standing still like statues, then burst into flames. Limbs are fused into bulkheads, and bodies are buried in the steel deck. Some soldiers are found standing upright in a bulkhead, their heads buried in the steel. Others simply vanished into thin air. Those who didn't die either go insane or are discharged from the army with the qualifier that they are no longer fit for duty. An underhanded way of keeping them quiet, because if they do talk, well, they're obviously not right in the head, right? The story might have been successfully swept under the rug right there if it wasn't for an author named Morris K Jessup. You might remember his name from our video on the SS Orang Medan mystery ship. We'll link to that video in the description below. That's a whole other can of crazy. Jessup taught astronomy and mathematics at Drake University as well as the University of Michigan. He operated the largest refracting telescope in the Southern Hemisphere and studied early cultures of Mexico, Incan remains in Peru, and participated in archaeological studies of Mayan ruins. So this guy is no intellectual slouch. In 1955, Jessup publishes a book called The Case for the UFO. The book is considered one of the early works in the study of UFOs and has gained attention for its exploration of unconventional ideas surrounding unidentified aerial phenomena. Keep in mind that opinions on UFOs have evolved since the book was published, but back then, it was a pretty brave thing to do because the subject of UFOs is pretty much considered a joke. As you might imagine, publishing a book on UFOs back in the 1950s gets Jessup a slew of mail, some from fans, some not so much. But in that stack came several letters from one individual. Enter one Carlos Aende. He was a merchant marine on the nearby ship SS Andrew Furuseth, and he writes to Jessup thinking Jessup might just be interested in his eyewitness accounts of, and in some versions, participation in U.S. Navy experiments on invisibility and teleportation of the USS Aldridge. Most of what we know today about the fate of the Aldridge comes from these letters, and Aende and Jessup would continue to write back and forth to each other for years. Interesting side note, this correspondence duo was actually a trio. The third side of the triangle, one Mr. Gray Barker, whose name many of you may recognize both from our video here on the In-Between about Albert Bender or from the greater paranormal community. Gray Barker was a prolific author on all things paranormal, but specifically on the Men in Black. So I guess I'm not all that surprised to find out that he figures into this story as well. And in case you are hankering for a classic MIB story, we'll also leave a link to our Albert Bender story in the description as well. Now, later that same year, 1955, the Office of Naval Research, or ONR, gets an envelope marked Happy Easter. Inside is a copy of Jessup's book with handwritten annotations all over the margins, seemingly written by 3 different people in 3 different colors of ink. These comments talked about being off Earth, aliens, and the mysteries of the universe. One big rumor floating around at the time was that the writings were from an actual alien. And one of the comments claimed his knowledge of a secret project in World War II to make a warship vanish, known as the U.S. Navy's Force Field Experiments in October of 1943. The ONR calls Jessup in to take a look at the book, and Jessup tells them that he's pretty sure he recognizes the handwriting of at least one of the annotators as being the same as the handwriting in letters he has received from Carlos Aende. Interestingly enough, the ONR evidently thinks the information in all of those crazy notes in the margins is of some interest because they actually go through the time and expense of having the whole thing reprinted, notes and all. The complete version is reprinted by a Texas company called Varro, thus giving birth to the famous Varro edition of the book. And there weren't many printed, but there is a copy of it online, and a link to it is in the description below. The Varro edition of the book is not locked down secret, so news of the experiments in Philadelphia starts to spread, and the legend of the Philadelphia experiment is born. Now, if the Varro edition of Jessup's book is just a hoax, why does the ONR go through all the trouble of copying and circulating the book? Most of it doesn't make any sense to anybody, but maybe it contains information that only the Navy can fully appreciate. Or are they just spending taxpayer dollars to spread what they think is a pretty good joke? That wouldn't surprise me. In 1965, Vincent H. Gaddis publishes one of the early accounts of the Philadelphia experiment in his book, Invisible Horizons: True Mysteries of the Sea. His take on the Varro edition? There was certainly something in the notes and letters that justified the time and cost of producing the Varro edition. What was it? Now, given the interesting nature of the letters and the annotations, Aende's interest in Jessup, and the ONR's obvious interest in the material, Jessup starts thinking maybe there's something to this and starts to dig in and see what he can find. At some point, he must figure out that what he's finding is pretty valuable information, because in the summer of 1958, Jessup gives everything he's collected on the Philadelphia experiment to his friend, writer Ivan T. Sanderson in New York for safekeeping, in case anything should happen to me. By 1959, Jessup declares that he has finished his Philadelphia experiment research and makes a dinner date with his friend, Dr. J. Manson Valentine, to go over everything that he's found. They make a date for April 20th, but Jessup never shows. Morris Jessup is found dead on April 20th, 1959 at 6:30 p.m. in Matheson's Hammock Park, Dade County, Florida, behind the wheel of his still-running 1958 white Chevy station wagon. Cause of death: acute carbon monoxide intoxication. He put a hose in the window of his car and suffocated on his car's exhaust fumes. And with that final act, the story of the Philadelphia experiment secures its place in the Conspiracy Theory Hall of Fame. How do I know this? Because 80 years later, we're still talking about it. But is it true? Well, like any good conspiracy theory, the answer is always maybe. So let's start at the beginning. And the beginning of this story is Carlos Aende. And much to the chagrin of all Philadelphia experiment believers, turns out Aende is pretty much a nut job. Even though people who have interviewed him over the years talk about his fluent Spanish and Spanish accent when speaking English, Carlos Miguel Aende is actually Carl Meredith Allen, born on May 31st, 1925 in the small town of Springdale, Pennsylvania, to an Irish dad and a partly French mom. Carlos spends some time in the U.S. Marines and then takes a job as a merchant marine, and he is working in Philadelphia when the experiments on the Aldridge are supposedly taking place. But beyond that, everything that comes out of his mouth has to be taken with a huge chunk of salt. One writer, Robert A. Gorman, while getting together information on an article on the Philadelphia experiment for the October 1980 edition of Fate magazine, goes and talks with Carlos's dad and reads through some of the letters he wrote to his parents over the years, including the one where he admits that he is the one who wrote all of the notes and annotations on the Varro edition of Jessup's book. Gorman's conclusion? Carlos loves to play games with those foolish enough to play audience. They say he is wicked smart, but a master leg puller. Okay, so Carlos is pretty much a no-go. Do we have anybody else? Well, yes. Alfred Bielek turns up in 1988 to say that he was on board the Aldridge as well. He says after all the experiments took place, he and others were brainwashed to forget all about it. And it wasn't until he saw the 1984 movie, The Philadelphia Experiment, that his memories came flooding back. Trouble is, his story is pretty much considered debunked as well, with many of his allegations within his ever-changing story being provably not true. And we're not even going to touch his claims that he and his brother jumped off the Aldridge during the experiment and landed in the year 2137. But considering it's his claims that sparked the sister conspiracy theory about the Montauk Project, maybe we'll dig into him in a future video. So what else do we have? In 1994, French-born astrophysicist and ufologist Jacques F. Vallée published an article in the Journal of Scientific Exploration titled Anatomy of a Hoax, the Philadelphia Experiment 50 Years Later. In a previous article about the Philadelphia experiment, Vallée had asked readers to contact him if they had additional information about the alleged event. And they did. Vallée receives a letter from Edward Dudon, a U.S. Navy vet who served from 1942 to 1945. Dudon is stationed as an electrician on the USS Angstrom at the Philadelphia Naval Yard during the summer of 1943. He has detailed knowledge of the classified devices on both his ship and the Aldridge, which he confirms is present at the time. But according to Dudon, the primary objective is not to render the ships invisible to radar, but to make them undetectable by the magnetic torpedoes used by the German U-boats, the degaussing procedure. Dudon is well aware of the wild tales circulating about the Philadelphia experiment. He's heard the stories of ships vanishing and sailors experiencing strange things, but according to him, it's just the sailors chatting, discussing the idea of being invisible to torpedoes and the peculiarities of the degaussing process. And as for that eerie green glow, well, in his opinion, it was probably just a thunderstorm or some fascinating St. Elmo's fire, which, according to him, is not all that uncommon. According to Dudon, the USS Aldridge sets sail at 11 p.m. the night it supposedly vanished, disappearing from view in the Philadelphia harbor. It's later seen in Norfolk, Virginia, and miraculously returns to Philadelphia harbor the next morning. Sounds like an impossible journey for an ordinary ship, right? Well, Dudon proposes a logical explanation. The Navy, with its special privileges, could have utilized the Chesapeake-Delaware Canal, slashing the trip duration to just 6 hours. So, Dudon's story is a pretty reasonable explanation for Carlos Aende's claims. And today, we know that electromagnetic energy in specific wavelengths can actually mess with your head with a whole range of effects, from ringing in the ears to hallucinations to a full-on complete coma. And electromagnetic energy in the right wavelengths can even cook things. They didn't know all this in 1943, but these effects sure sound a lot like what Aende says he witnessed. And Jacques Vallée, the guy who interviewed Dudon for his article on the anatomy of a hoax, says that powerful, vivid images are the secret sauce for any long-lasting hoax. You know, like the fake surgeon's photo of the Loch Ness Monster, or those tricky pics of the Cottingley fairies. So, including in the story these crystal clear mental snapshots of a ship vanishing and the crew getting all messed up serves the intended purpose of hitting the listener on an emotional level that will stick with them. But wait, there's more. In 1999, the Philadelphia Inquirer reported on a reunion of sailors who served on the USS Aldridge in Atlantic City. Here's the kicker. These sailors insisted the ship never docked in Philadelphia. Nope, it was chilling in Brooklyn on the exact date it supposedly vanished. And guess what? The ship's log backs them up. Plus, the captain straight up says that they never pulled any experiments on that vessel. But wait a minute. Edward Dudon, the other debunker, says the ship was in Philadelphia in October of 1943. So the debunkers can't keep their story straight? They can't both be true. So who's lying and why? Could it be that the Navy does have something to hide after all? If they did conduct an invisibility experiment gone wrong, they wouldn't exactly broadcast it. And of course, the Navy denies any such experiment ever took place. But wouldn't be the first time we've seen the military involved in some shady stuff, right? Remember, these are the same guys who conducted mustard gas experiments on our own soldiers without their knowledge or consent. So I know I am not the only one around who does not necessarily trust the military. All right, so given that it's pretty easy to discredit the military, do we have anything else we can point to that says the story's true? We do. In the 1940s, the BBC has a radio series called The Brains Trust, which is like a roundtable discussion with various people, including Naval Commander A.B. Campbell and Julian Huxley, the brother of the famous Aldous Huxley, author of Brave New World. In this program, the brainy panel answers various impromptu questions mailed in by their UK listeners. But apparently, on one show, Commander Campbell tells the story of a sailor walking through walls, etc. Ready for the shocker? This is only 55 days after the Philadelphia experiment is supposed to have taken place, long before Carlos Aende starts sending letters to Morris Jessup. In 1945, in their book The Philadelphia Experiment, Bill Moore and Charles Berlitz write about a guard, known only in the book as Jim, who claims to have seen part of a classified film as it was being watched by a group of Navy brass. He recalls, after a time, the central ship, a destroyer, disappeared slowly into a transparent fog until all that could be seen was an imprint of that ship in the water. Then, when the field, or whatever it was turned off, the ship reappeared slowly out of thin fog. And in early 1951, a guy named Harry Houghton, serving on the USS Gaynard, or DD-706, told a fellow shipmate that he had been a part of an electric camouflage experiment where, whether it was an accident or they meant to actually do that, optical invisibility was achieved. Okay, so we have a few bits of corroboration, but for me, the devil is in the details. And that always seems to be the case in a cover-up. What details? The details of the suicide of Morris Jessup. We know that he was worried about his safety because he gave copies of his research to his friend Ivan for safekeeping. And we know that on or after April 17th, Jessup set up a dinner date for April 20th with his friend Jay Manson to talk about the results of his years of research into the Philadelphia experiment. But he never shows because he apparently decided to drive to a park, put a hose in his tailpipe, and kill himself instead. Now, I certainly am not going to rule out that he actually was suicidal. There are plenty of friends and family around who have stated that Jessup was having a hard time with a possible divorce and the constant questioning of his character brought about by daring to author books on the crazy subject of UFOs. Book sales were not good, and even his own daughter wasn't exactly in his corner. He even went so far as to write a long, depressing letter to his friend John Nebel in New York that John says pretty much sounded like a suicide note. All right, so life wasn't a bed of roses for Jessup at that time. But let's take a look at those devilish details. First, he made that dinner date with Dr. Valentine just 1 to 3 days beforehand. Now, that's not an open and shut case that he wanted to live, but unusual all the same. Now, let's take a look at the scene. The hose leading from the muffler to the car was a 2-inch wide hose, so not like a regular garden hose. That was not just shoved into the end of the tailpipe. It was wired to the tailpipe. Interesting. I would think that to do that would take some extra time and tools. Why would he bother to go through all of that if he's planning on doing this in the parking lot of a park? And the rags used in the back window to make an airtight seal were wet, but there was no place around where he could have wet them down. He was pronounced dead by one Dr. Harry Reed, who apparently lived in the neighborhood and just happened upon the scene. Well, in researching Jessup's death, author Aende Genslinger started digging in to try to find Dr. Reed to interview him. She spoke with every Dr. Harry Reed living in Dade County, and none of them said they were anywhere near Matheson Hammock Park that night. And why would a doctor take on the responsibility of pronouncing someone dead at the scene when the coroner was already on his way? That action carries responsibilities with it. Why would he take on that role when he supposedly just came upon the scene accidentally, knowing nothing about the circumstances? Why would he want to have his name tied to something he knows nothing about? Also, Jessup's wife refused to identify his body. Regardless of what their current marital situation was, she was certain that Jessup did not commit suicide. And other than this little tiny newspaper clipping from the Fort Myers News Press on Wednesday, April 22nd, 1959, so 2 days after Jessup's death, no obituaries are ever printed. Not a smoking gun, but certainly odd. And despite suicide being one of the circumstances that would prompt a mandatory autopsy, no autopsy was ever done on Jessup. So we will never know if there were any other drugs or alcohol in his system that would have impaired his actions or even his judgment. But to me, the biggest red flag is his briefcase that he was seen with on that day was nowhere to be found. Again, not a smoking gun, but no notes or research or manuscript of any kind are ever found. Pretty odd for a guy who makes his living as an author. So you know what? It kind of looks like he might have been murdered for what he knew about the Philadelphia experiment. If you think about it, a smart guy like him doesn't seem likely to kill himself right when he's on the verge of a big breakthrough, right? What's your take on this? Drop me a comment below. Jessup's tragic death ends up adding legitimacy to the Philadelphia experiment legend. His actions contribute to fueling and validating speculations that there might be something substantial to the story. So I think it's pretty safe to say that the Philadelphia experiment conspiracy won't be kicking the bucket anytime soon. It's like it's got a life all of its own. And it's birthed a whole new myth called the Montauk Project that I mentioned earlier, which is all about the Montauk Air Force Base in the 1980s and how the government used the success of the Philadelphia experiment to manipulate the flow of time. Crazy, right? Well, if you're curious about the Montauk Project, let me know, and we might dive into that rabbit hole in another video. So where does all of this leave us in figuring out the truth of the Philadelphia experiment? In my opinion, pretty much where we started. Other than some ironclad documents getting into the right hands, I don't think we're ever going to get any concrete answers. So I will just leave you with this. After the Aldridge served out its time as a seafaring vessel, it was sold for scrap to a company in Greece who kept it moored up for years as it went through the decommissioning and deconstruction process. And according to William Reinard of Shikshinny, Pennsylvania, who in the summer of 2000 was in Greece with some World War II vets trying to get a World War II tank landing ship up and running, was approached by some Greek sailors who pointed out the Aldridge sitting right across the harbor from them. According to the sailors, the ship is haunted, with screams and strange humming noises heard on a regular basis. And despite the job of making regular rounds through the ship being a one-man job, no one patrols that ship alone. This topic is yet another bottomless pit of information. And trust me, I am sure I won't be the last person digging into this case, even if a century has passed. If you're in the mood for digging for more hidden knowledge, just click on this video right here. Be careful out there, and I will see you here again on the In-Between.